We are delighted here at the Kansas City Public Library to have the return of David Stewart. David Stewart, after a fine career as a lawyer and a litigator, developed a second career. A few years ago, he published a book called 1787 about the summer in which this nation was created. Became a bestseller, wonderful book. A couple of years ago, he published Impeached, another wonderful book about Andrew Johnson's impeachment, one of the great trials, of course, in American history. And we were happy to have him here at the Public Library talking about that. Now we're doubly happy, I'm doubly happy to have him here with American Emperor, his wonderful book about Aaron Burr, the various conspiracies, the duel with Alexander Hamilton, the alleged attempt to separate from the United States, the western part of the United States, and the great trial presided over by John Marshall. But also there's an event in the book that I think you need to read about, page 67 actually, in which the sort of proto-Aaron Burrs tried to separate West Florida from the Spanish and created an independent empire. They were my relatives, the Kempers, Reuben, Nathaniel, and Samuel. You can read about them. They lasted about a week before the Spanish showed up and chased them away. But the book is full of great stories. David Stewart has become a great author of popular history now. In some academic languages, popular history is not thought of very highly, but it has become a great art form in the hands of people like David McCullough and Edmund Morris at his best, and David Stewart, and some academic historians have become great popular historians like David Hackett Fisher, Barry Strauss, who's been here in the library, for instance, or John Ferling. And it's about narrative. It's about telling stories. We know that. We know that's what makes it popular. But in the hands of a master like David Stewart, it's much more. It's about telling us what's important about our history. It's about human character and what it has to do with the story, and usually told with some sympathy for the human characters, as difficult, as odd as they may be, as Aaron Burr was, for instance, and with the right amount of color, the kind of color that we all see in the most interesting characters in our daily lives. I should say, not quite as colorful as perhaps Gore Vidal's take on Aaron Burr, but then I think of Gore Vidal as the Kitty Kelly of historical fiction. And then every great historian has a unique talent, and David Stewart, with his training as a lawyer, brings to history what I think of as a forensic attitude towards the evidence. And this can be distinguished from an argumentative attitude that many academic historians take. It is a genuine concern with where the evidence leads us. And when motives are mixed, as they clearly are in this story, it's a particularly great quality to have. So the question that David will answer for us tonight, that his book answers, and I hope the talk will answer, was Aaron Burr our Catiline? Was he a traitor, or was he merely another Western adventurer? Or maybe a little bit of both. David Stewart.
Thank you very much, Crosby, and thank you all for coming out. It is a treat to be back here in this wonderful building on a somewhat breezy day, and to have the opportunity to talk about Aaron Burr, which is always fun. I was interested in doing this story because I read in very good histories by good historians about Burr going west after the duel with Hamilton, and the historians would say something like, whatever he was up to. And it seemed to me that the man had been the third vice president of the United States. We really ought to have an idea what he was up to. There ought to be records, there ought to be an account. And then, of course, there was this big trial he had, which I'll talk about. And so I set out in pursuit of that story, and I found a remarkable story. It's really 2 parts adventure tale and 1 part courtroom thriller. But before I get into that, I want to cover a little background so we're all sort of starting at this place where we can pick Burr up with this adventure, which is the United States in 1805. The story really happens between 1805 and 1807. The country is not yet 20 years old under the Constitution. It's an infant. We don't really know how things are going to turn out. We don't know how much of the government's going to work. We've had some basic problems. The election in 1796 had an odd outcome. Under the Constitution, it didn't work the way it works now. It's been amended. The states chose electors. The electors went in and voted for president. They each had 2 votes, and whoever got the highest number of votes was president. Whoever came in second was vice president. So John Adams was elected president, then his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, was elected vice president. That's sort of odd. Then, in the election of 1800, they didn't want to have that happen again, so all the Republicans, that was Jefferson's party, voted a straight for Jefferson and Burr, who was supposed to be his vice presidential candidate. So the result was that Burr and Jefferson ended up in a tie. There was no winner. So under the Constitution, the election went into the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, the Federalists decided that they liked Burr better than they liked Jefferson, and they would vote for Burr. So there were 35 ballots in the House of Representatives. It took a week for the House to choose a president. It was really a constitutional crisis before Burr finally sends a note and says, no one should vote for me, and the logjam breaks. Now, that's not only a symptom of how new we were, how parts of the Constitution just weren't working. It was amended in 1803 to fix that. Still have the Electoral College, so still fix that. But it also gives you some sense for why Thomas Jefferson might not have liked Aaron Burr very much. And that's one of the undertones of this story, which is Jefferson and Burr never got along. They were very different people, but after 1800, after that election experience, Jefferson was never going to do anything for Burr and frankly was going to pay him back. Now the other thing, another feature of this, of course, was there were secession movements. It was not at all clear that the United States were going to remain the United States. Just a year before, in 1804, there had been a secession movement in New England, and some of the leaders had come to Burr and asked him to join them, and to lead New York out of the Union. There had been a secession movement in the West. The West at the time was Kentucky and Tennessee, Mississippi, Ohio, just the lands over the Appalachian Mountains. And they had, in the 1780s and early 1790s, flirted with seceding and becoming really a vassal state of Spain because they wanted to send their goods through New Orleans, which was controlled by Spain. And Spain was not allowing American goods through. There was an active secession movement then. Indeed, in the 1790s, there were 2 rebellions in Pennsylvania. There was the Whiskey Rebellion and the Freeze Rebellion. Both rebellions were led by people who didn't want to pay taxes. This is an American staple. Our politics hasn't changed a whole lot. But it was shocking to find a letter that Jefferson wrote, and he actually wrote this sentiment twice in 1804, when he wrote really with bland indifference at the prospect of secession. He said, whether we remain in one confederacy or form into Atlantic and Mississippi confederacies, I believe not very important to the happiness of either part. Those of the Western Confederacy will be as much our children and descendants as those of the Eastern. And I feel myself as much identified with that country in future time as with this. Imagine if President Obama were to say of California, well, if they want to go their own way, that's okay. I'll still think well of them. But it was not only a question whether we would stay together, it was really a question as to what the United States was at this time. Of course, I've got this map up here of 1805. We've got the original 13 states along the Atlantic coast. Then the mountains aren't shown there, but on the other side of the mountains, you've got Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. and the various territories. And then just 2 years before, in 1803,